try to set the stage for you a little bit tonight before we dive into where we're going to be, which is First Chronicles chapter 16. If you remember from your history, that it was the mission of David all along to take the Ark of the Covenant, which was the residing presence of God with the nation of Israel. And he wanted to bring that to Jerusalem, which is where he has chosen to reign, the city which he has chosen to reign over the nation of Israel. On the first attempt, you remember, he built a new cart and he went through a very organized plan in order to establish and carry out and bring that Ark of the Covenant all the way from its place where it was residing to Jerusalem. But along the way, you remember, things got a little rocky, I guess. And it got to a point where it looked like the Ark of the Covenant was about to fall off this new ark. They didn't have ratchet straps, I don't think. So the ark began to slide off of the cart. Uzzah sticks up his hand, and Uzzah dies right there. So we set it down at the house of Obed-Edom, and we come back a little bit later. And this time we obey what God says. We pick it up on the poles, which it's supposed to be carried, and we bring it to Jerusalem. Finally, the Ark of the Covenant is in Jerusalem through this great procession. Every 6-7 steps, a sacrifice. Can you imagine how many sacrifices? Every few steps, we're sacrificing something else to God. And then, of course, the organized procession, I suppose. Hundreds of people playing musical instruments, giving praise all the way to Jerusalem. Quite the parade. But now it's here, all right? And we arrive in First Chronicles chapter 16 after a lot of anticipation, I suppose. And in First Chronicles chapter 16, David gives the instructions to sing a song of thanksgiving to God. And this is because now the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant, is in Jerusalem finally. As you get to the end of this particular psalm of praise, which could be akin to Psalm 106, we arrive at verse 35 and verse 36. Let's read that. Say also, save us, O God of our salvation, and gather and deliver us from among the nations, that we may give thanks to your holy name and glory in your praise. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, from everlasting to everlasting. Then all the people said, Amen, and praise the Lord. There's a lot here in verse 35 alone that I believe deserve quite a bit of our attention. And the first thing that we're going to notice in verse 35 is the actions of God, because this is what God has done that deserves and merits our praise and subsequently his glory, right? So we see, save us, O God of our salvation, and gather and deliver us from among the nations. Two things, I suppose we could boil it down to those two things. One of those is to gather us, right? Gather and deliver us from among the nations. Now, I'll tell you, right before we got here to church, before we came, I gathered up all the toys in the house. And I made this pile that's about 5 feet wide by 5 feet tall. And I made this big old pile. And when we get home, I'm going to say, kids, come get your toys and go put them up. We know what the act of gathering is. Every spring, every fall, and about once a month, we have this sweet gumball tree in our backyard. The thing was made by Satan. It has these little spiky balls that come out and they never go away. And just when you think that you've got every single one of them, you look up in the tree and you see 1.7 million more hanging there, taunting you. And we gather those up. We know what it is to gather, don't we? We know what the implications of gathering is that there's things everywhere. The toys, I walked into the living room and it's not 5 foot by 5 foot, but I walked in, there were toys everywhere. So I just started bringing them all in gumballs as they fall. They're everywhere. The first thing, before things get gathered, there has to be the scattering, right? They've got to be dispersed, toys strewn out everywhere. And then there has to be this central location where you bring them, right? I mean, that's the whole point of gathering them, is to bring them all to one central point. So when we gather whatever it is, sweet gumballs or toys or whatever it is, we know what we're talking about. So when we look at this verse and we say and we see God gather us, you've got to in your mind remember your Israelite history. David is king of a united kingdom, right? The kingdom hasn't been divided. In fact, they are living at this point in history at one of the most peaceful times in their whole history. Could he be talking about a foreshadowing of things that are coming? I don't know. But I do know that this plea for God to gather his people, it implies that there may come a time when God's people are dispersed, that they are scattered, that they need to come to a central location to God so that God can take care of them. I think if you're looking for a good commentary, and the Bible is its best commentary, I think what we read Jesus say in Matthew chapter 23 is worth putting a note in the margin of your Bible, because I believe this is a great commentary on what it means to gather, this plea to God to gather us. Now we're in the final days of Jesus's life. You remember, we are, to my understanding, on Tuesday of, we came into Jerusalem on Sunday. We're on Tuesday of his final week. Over the horizon, you see in Matthew chapter 23, you see Jerusalem rising. And Jesus says this, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together, as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." I think this is an epitome of what it means to gather. When God gathers us, we see Jesus is unifying, right? To bring them together to, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. How often would I have gathered you together? That when we are gathered by God, there is this hint of protection, isn't there? We're in the presence of God. How often would I have gathered you together? How? Like a hen gathers her brood under my wings, right behind me. The protection of God. And of course, when we're talking about being gathered by God and being unified, being protected, what we see here is that God actually also wants to teach. You see that here in verse 37? What have I done? I've sent to you prophets. Look at plural. Why? To teach. And you keep killing them. Gather us. What a wonderful visual it is that Jesus describes here for us about what it means to be gathered. The other thing that you see in verse 35 is not just gathering as an action of God, but you also see the deliverance. Save us, O God of our salvation. Not just save us, he says, deliver us too. Deliver us. Now, this is kind of interesting because I read this contextually, and there's a lot of things that are ironic about it, at least from what I see. Because most of the time when we think about David, at least in my mind, maybe you think about him as this young strapping lad trying to be fitted with the armor of Saul, carrying a stone and a sling. Or maybe you think about David as many of the Israelites did, and it seems the way that God did, as a man of war, stained with blood. But the picture that we get of David here, if we go back and look at chapter 15, before this parade gets started, David is, look at it in verse 27, he's wearing a linen robe. He's not dressed in this armor. He's not carrying a sword. He doesn't have his helmet on. But his petition is, God, deliver me. If David was going to war at this moment, David would be very vulnerable. But David still trusts in God. I also think it's interesting, as you read along in First Chronicles, you look at chapter 14, obviously, before you get to chapter 15 and chapter 16, right? Chapter 15 is where the ark, we begin to bring it in. 16 is where we're at. In chapter 14, this is David's strategy for battle, all right? For deliverance, for salvation, right? This is how I'm going to protect the nation of Israel. He's facing the Philistines, and look at what he does in verse 10. David inquired, chapter 14, verse 10. David inquired of God. And then you look at verse 13. And the Philistines yet again made a raid in the valley, and David again inquired of God. We think about David as a man of war and maybe dressed in that armor of God or whatever you want to call it, maybe carrying the sword of Goliath. But David always sought guidance from God. Here he is in this moment in a very vulnerable state militarily, dressed in just linen, and he's seeking guidance from God. Ironically enough, we see from the parallel in 2 Samuel 7, verse 1, that this is the moment when David had rest all around. So let's put it all together. God, deliver us from among the nations. David's not dressed for war, is he? God, deliver us from all the nations. David's not fighting the war. God, deliver us from all the nations. And yet, David has peace. I propose that when we don't trust in ourselves, when we fully trust in God, that God, even in times of war, God will give us peace. if we trust Him to deliver us. Certainly did with David. The actions of God. God, gather us. God, deliver us. Save us. And what that does, the actions of God, it prompts a reaction of man. And the reaction that we see in verse 35 is twofold. The first is that of gratitude, and the second is that of glory. Look at what it says. Again, verse 35, say also, save us, O God of our salvation, and gather and deliver us from among the nations, that we may give thanks to your holy name. I believe that gratitude and thanksgiving will absolutely overflow from our life when we recognize who God is. Give thanks to your, look at it, your holy name. I mean, it's one thing to think about God as holy and being sovereign, but when you think about just His very name is holy, it was so holy and it is so revered that these Masoretic scribes, as they transcribed or as they wrote down the words of God, they wouldn't do it. When the name Jehovah came along, they wouldn't write it down. They wouldn't put in all the letters. So we arrive at what we have now is what we call the Tetragrammaton, YHWH. And what we have done is we have inserted vowels that make sense to us, and we arrive at Yahweh. But the name of God was so holy, it was so revered that they wouldn't even dare write it down. Those, those pages on which it was written, if they became damaged, they would bury them because they so revered the name of God. And we flippantly say it as if it's nothing. And even worse for myself, I put up with it and tolerate it and say that's just the way of the world. The holy name of God, when we recognize who God is, we will give Him thanks because He loves me and I am a worthless sinner. I also think that this gratitude, it's going to flow from David because he sees the relief. I mean, can you imagine that moment in David's mind? Put yourself in his shoes when the Ark of the Covenant enters into Jerusalem and it's sat down at its place and nobody has to touch it again. One man's already died over it. Can you imagine the relief of David when that ark was finally where he wanted it to be? Give thanks to God. Give thanks to His holy name. And of course, as we already alluded to, 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 1, David had rest all around. And I'm the world's worst at this, all right? Time for a confession. I'm the world's worst at resting and embracing rest. Because all right, if things are going great in my mind, I'm always thinking, well, what's next? What's about to happen? It can't go good forever. You know what I'm saying? Y'all might not be like that. But in the back of my mind, I can't rest because I know that something bad's about to happen. But what we need to do is to be thankful for the rest. In those moments when we have rest and when things are going great, we need to be thankful. Thank God that we have that moment of rest, that peace, that moment like David is experiencing right here, right now. The action is gratitude, and it's followed immediately by glory. That we may give thanks to your holy name and glory in your praise. There's a lot of things in which God demands glory, and God deserves glory. I want to bring your attention back, and we're not going to go through all of it, but go back and look at some of the things that are said here in chapter 16. Look at the description and how it demands glory. He goes back and he recalls all the way back to Abraham, the past, all the things that God has already done up to this point. It demands that God gets glory. Look at verse 8. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, call upon his name, make known his deeds among the nations. Give thanks to God. Why? Look at everything that he's already done among all these peoples that have already been. You look at verse 12. Remember the wondrous works that he has done, his miracles and the judgments he has uttered. When we think back in our minds and see and remember the actions of God that have already happened, it ought to bring us to a spot where we give glory to him. The past. We also, as you move through this, you see the person of God and who he's described as in verse 14. God is the judge. The judge demands the glory. As you look at verse 15 and 16 and 17, you see how God is eternal. Remember his covenant forever, the word that he commanded for 1,000 generations, the covenant that he made with Abraham, his sworn promise to Isaac, which he confirmed to Jacob as a statute, to Israel an everlasting covenant. When we remember that our God, the God that we serve, the God that invites us to worship him, is eternal, it ought to bring us to our knees to glorify him. I love 18 through 22. I'm just going to read it because this is the person of God. He does two things. He provides and he protects. Against all odds, God provides for his people and God protects his people. This is what he said to Abraham, Isaac, to Jacob, to Israel. To you I will give the land of Canaan as your portion for an inheritance. Verse 18. When you were few in number, of little account, and sojourners in it, wandering from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another people, he allowed no one to oppress them. He rebuked kings on their account, saying, touch not my anointed ones, do my prophets no harm. God protects his people. God provides for his people. Not just it, he provides for them this beautiful land, a land flowing with milk and honey. That demands that we glorify God. Has God ever protected you? Can you remember the last time that God provided for you? I don't know about you, but God provided me supper tonight. God provides everything, doesn't he? Let me see your hands real quick. Everybody usually perks up when I say, let me see your hands. Let me see your hands. If you had supper already. All right. How many of you got full? You ate a meal today. How many of you got full at that meal? How many of you had leftovers? Nobody likes leftovers. I love them. but it proves that God gives you more than enough. The fact that you can get full, the fact that you can have not just enough for that meal, but leftovers, God provides. God provides abundantly, and we ought to glorify God because of his provision. In verses 23 through 27, we see God's power. In verse 24, he's sovereign. Declare his glory among the nations, his marvelous works among all the peoples. God is supreme over everybody in verse 24. God is in verse 25. Look at this. For great is the Lord, and he is to be feared above all gods. Verse 26. For all the gods of the peoples are worthless idols. My God is alive. You look everywhere in the world, the things that people trust in, it's nothing, but my God is living. My God is alive. But verse 27 is my favorite of all because we see what is in God's presence, okay? This is before God. This is in the presence of God. Three things: splendor, majesty, and strength. If you could personify splendor, majesty, and strength as three individuals who were serving in the presence of God, they are all here in front of him. Splendor, majesty, and strength. God deserves glory. When we see him as he is, we give him glory. When we think about all the things that he has done, we give him thanks because God has gathered us, delivered us. One day, we can have the opportunity to experience what we read about in verse 27, to be in to be in that place with him. Splendor, majesty, and strength. And if you want to throw in number 4, joy. You can have joy in the presence of God from everlasting to everlasting if you want it. If you're not on that path to be in the presence of God, he wants you. He wants you to be with him. He wants you to give him glory in this life so you can live with him in glory in the next life. If you're subject to the invitation, won't you come as we stand?